DNA is a powerful tool to address specific questions, especially when it comes to modern DNA.
You mentioned population genetics.
We don't know anything about the maternal history of the people or the Book of Mormon.
Let's just think critically about this for a second. Let's just really try to analyze this.
A lot of that is how the question is formulated.
You got to play by the rules. You got to understand how DNA works. It's not as sure as you're saying.
How do we frame the history and the context of where we place the Book of Mormon and its people in?
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Sword and Spirit. My name is Daniel. I'm your host today. I'm here with my co-host, David. And today we're joined by Ugo Perego. Did I say that last name right, Ugo? Or
Perego.
Okay.
Perego.
Okay. Perego. Awesome. Well, Ugo, thanks so much for being on today. For people that don't know who you are or your work, just tell us a little bit about yourself, just who you are, your upbringing in the church, and what you do as a profession, just to give a little bit of context for who you are.
So, I'm Italian, first of all. That's kind of explains the funny accent. And I was born and raised there and lived my whole youth in Italy. I decided at a certain point I wanted to serve a full-time mission, so I was called to the United States at that time. And then at the end of my mission, I had the opportunity to go to BYU, which was an opportunity I never really thought about it before my life. You know, a lot of kids kind of like go through high school, or there's like, I'm going to go to BYU someday. It never even crossed my mind to do that. But I had the opportunity, and it was a good choice. I went there first as out of curiosity, not really know what I was gonna study or do there, and then like Elder Holland once say, you kind of like need to let the Lord push you, gently pushes, and let Him take you where He wants you to take. I feel like that was very much what happened to me. The very fact to go to BYU was an answer to specific prayers. I actually, believe it or not, I was accepted at BYU, but it took me 1 year to make up my mind if I wanted to go there. And, that sounds kind of like a little bit weird, because a lot of kids were like, oh, I got BYU, I'm going to go there right now, but I actually debated whether I should go. And it was a great choice, love it, love the BYU campus life. And that's where in my graduate study, when I finished my bachelor degree, I started studying for my master's degree. I met Professor Scott Woodward, and he was a molecular biologist. Not to be confused, there is another Scott Woodward from BYU Idaho that is a great church historian and teacher of gospel doctrine. This is a professor, molecular biologist Scott Woodward. And at that time, we became good friends, and he became quite a mentor to me. I was fascinated by his work with ancient Egyptian mummies, with ancient Egyptian relics, with the Dead Sea Scrolls. He was a professor at Hebrew University, piecing pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls together through DNA, since they were written on animal skin. So I was fascinated by that. I also, during that time, I went to Jerusalem with BYU as a study abroad student. And the fact that I came back and met him, so it was kind of like a scientific love at first sight, and I was immediately interested in the type of work he was doing. And at that time, he was starting a new project. He needed somebody to run that project. That became the foundation of a lot of the genetic formation that I receive, DNA, and its application to answer questions that have to do with genealogy, with family relationships, with forensic DNA, with paternity testing, and of course with population genetics, which is what then eventually will tie in with some of the questions that people have asked me with regard of DNA in the Book of Mormon and other church history questions that I use DNA to answer. But anyway, that's kind of like what my education was. I did my PhD with probably one of the greatest mind in population genetics. You probably are familiar that when you choose your graduate studies, it's not just what you're gonna study, but it's also where you're gonna study and with who or under which mentorship you're going to study with. And they become kind of like your scientific mentors, through that process. It's not just like going and taking a bunch of classes, fulfilling the requirement, and get out of it. Is being somewhat your PhD coordinator pet. You do what he says. If they say jump, you don't say why, you say how high. And that's kind of like what it is. And so I had the opportunity and the privilege to study with Professor Antonio Torroni from Italy, who was and happened to be one of the very first people to identify genetic markers in the Native American populations back in the 1980s.
That's awesome. And you mentioned two things, and I just want to touch on them just real quick before we jump in. And part of our discussion, but just for a little bit of context, before jumping into today's discussion on DNA in the Book of Mormon, just real quick, could you just define two terms? I'm decently, I think, aware of them, but a lot of our viewers may not necessarily be aware of them. So the first question I have is, you mentioned population genetics.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just elaborate on what that is for people that aren't aware of what that is?
Sure. Basically, there are, since the discovery of DNA and mapping the human genome in the last, between the 1950s and the 2000, in those 50 years, we are now in a stage where we can use DNA for a number of things. It can be used in pharmacology, in medicine. There is a lot of different applications that can be done. One of the things that DNA has proven to be a game changer has to be with the capabilities to use it to identify individuals. But not only to identify an individual, because we all have, in our DNA, we have pieces of DNA that are unique to ourselves, or at least the way that they are recombined, that they are assembled, that are unique. And we can see from the fact that we don't look alike anyone else. As one example, we might look similar to somebody else, like our siblings, our parents, but we don't look identical to them. And that's because the recombination, the shuffling of the DNA one generation to the other creates unique combination, genetic combination, of which our appearance is only part of the, we call it expression, the way that the DNA, the genes are expressing themselves or showing or manifesting themselves to the naked eye, observable traits, we call them in genetics. And so that's one thing, genetics become a unique fingerprint to identify unique individuals. But also there are parts that we share with other individuals, and that allowed us to establish relationship, previously unknown relationship. A simple example is a paternity test, where a father is not sure that the child is his child, right? And so with a DNA test, that can be unmistakably proven if it is or it is not the biological child, with all the implication that that information might provide to that man. That's just a simple, familiar use of DNA testing, in creating that connection. As we look at the broader picture, then we move into the study of ancestral study or population migration or population genetics, which is going back in time and determine, since DNA is inherited, and create like a link between the present and past generations, as well as providing a link between us and future generation. And there are actually statistical models that can be used to see where are we heading, with genetics of human population or any population. Okay, population genetics is not limited to human genetics. Population genetics is the DNA of dolphins and whales and penguins and spiders and wheat, and so anything that is alive has DNA, and you can study and reconstruct the history of any human or other living organism. Based on the DNA, you can tell something about their stories, where they've been, what happened, major changes in what happened. You can tell when, for example, things like corn or wheat was became an agricultural product rather than a wild product. You can tell when dogs were domesticated and cows were domesticated from being, wild animals and become, and you can tell that with humans. Where have we been? Where did we go? Where are our ancestors from? All of that has implication with population genetics. And of course, you also can use the same type of information for forensic studies to identify criminals, unknown victims, remains that have been buried and or found that you don't know who they belong to. So the genetic testing used for paternity testing, population studies and migration, genealogy, ancestry, and forensic are similar. It's just what you use them for that is different.
I see. And then between population genetics and genetic markers, is population or are genetic markers just incorporated into population genetics, or are they their own separate entity?
Genetic markers, which is a very broad term, you need to define what is a genetic marker, because if you look at the DNA of an individual, that DNA, the smallest unit of that DNA is a nucleotide, okay? And a nucleotide is attached to another nucleotide, which is attached to another nucleotide in a polymer, which is a chain of repeated nucleotides, all connected together through chemical bonds, making about 3.2 billion pieces of nucleotides and forming the human genome. That's in us. So we have 3.2 somewhere in there. I mean, we haven't really settled on the final number yet, but let's say it's about 3.2 billion nucleotides attached together in a long chain. And depending if you look at a single nucleotide, okay, or if you're looking at a segment or a chain or a sequence of these nucleotides, that could be defined as a marker, okay. And usually what these markers indicated, some of them can be found in higher frequencies or in larger number, to use a simpler language, in a specific population. And in other population, the same markers might be in a smaller number or in even not existing anymore in certain population. And so, I can have my DNA test done, and if I have certain markers that are found mostly in the Mediterranean basin or the Mediterranean area, that might link my origins to that specific location. And so, we call this marker, these markers are specific, that doesn't mean that they are all the markers of that population, but those are some markers that have been chosen and identified for a specific location or a specific geographic origin. Now, there are a lot of limitations about that. For example, we think of Italy or Europe the way that it is today. There is a place called Germany, a place called France, right? Well, that wasn't the case 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, right? You still have the landmass, but it wasn't divided geographically as it is today. And people were not limited to stay, I reached the French border, I'm not going to pass it, I'm going to stay right here. Well, French didn't exist, and neither is border. So people would move wherever they needed to move based on climatic condition, food availability, warfare, whatever that was. They were driven and moving and captured and enslaved and traded and killed throughout history. So there have been things that have impacted original gene pools or the markers found in a population in the past versus those that are found today. And there's been a lot of flow in between this population, a lot more than we might think is possible. Again, it was not limited by geographic condition. I usually, to finish, a marker, often in population genetics, identify a fork. So you have let's say, an ancestral genome, like a pass from one person to another person, generation after generation. And then all at once, you have what's called a random mutation, which means a change in what has been traditionally in previous generation the DNA of a family line, right? So now an individual, let's say, has two children, two boys or two daughters, or a boy and a girl, whatever. He has two children, one with the mutation and one without the mutation. So the one without the mutation is continuing to carry on the ancestral genetic line. It's passing the one that used to be this father and the grandfather and the great grandfather and so on. The other child has a mutated gene, and that gene is creating basically a new branch, okay, because it's going to pass that marker to his or her posterity, thus creating a separate branch. So that's like a fork on a road, right? And now you have a tree, and you can use this genetic. And say, if those two children, one decide, hey, I'm gonna go, there is not enough land for me here. Why don't you stay here, and I'm gonna go and find my fortune somewhere else. I'm gonna jump on this ship and go across the world and see if I can start my life there. Well, he's gonna take that genetics with him or with her, and then have children in the new location, and those mutations will pass on in the new place, and the old unmutated DNA will be in the older place. And so now you have two populations that are divided or distinguished by that forking event. That's kind of like a general way to explain how markers are used. They become pinpoints or milestone in the history of population. But some are relevant and some are not. Some are common and some are not. Some are very clearly identified with specific population or migration group, and some are not. I'll give you a quick example. There was a study a number of years ago that was linked to the priestly class of Judaism. They say, that every male that carried this genetic marker, which was named the Cohen haplotype, Cohen, Cohen haplotype, everyone carrying that marker, that DNA marker, was part of the priestly legacy in Judaism. And everybody's like, oh, cool, we found that, the gene for that. But then somebody else came along and started testing more people in the Middle East, like the Arabs, for example. And guess what they found out? They also had that marker, right? So it wasn't specific to that priestly group, it was more a Middle Eastern marker that was used. Do all the people in the Middle East have that marker? No. Does having that marker make you part of the Middle East genetic pool? It doesn't. But it seems that the majority of people that have that marker come from the Middle East, but they're not exclusively from Jewish ancestry.
Yeah, that's great. And any resources that we will discuss, for those listening, we've said this many times in past episodes, but we'll make sure to link it in our description below if you're interested in looking more into some of this work. So, but awesome, that was great, and we'll just jump right in to this discussion, to this kind of Q&A, because one of the things in the Book of Mormon it talks about is how that the Lamanites and the Nephites, more specifically the Lamanites, are originally until a bit of years ago, the church in their introduction of the Book of Mormon talked about how the Book of Mormon or the Lamanites were the principal ancestors of the Native Americans. And then with DNA markers, it seemed to show that these Native Americans, from these different areas, didn't seem to come from like Jerusalem, that they came more from, if I remember correctly, was it I believe it was more Asia, right? Is that my understanding?
Yeah.
So critics with this will say, oh, this is a smoking gun for Mormonism because it proves, or at least shows, that the Lamanites and the Nephites, that they didn't exist because DNA disproves such a thing. Now, obviously, there's some assumptions there, like assuming that Joseph thought, and others around him who thought that they were the only people here at the time. But let's discuss that, real quick. First, with these few assumptions that we have, I want to just kind of discuss that real quick. For DNA, is the critic, would you say, valid in their criticism that, well, Nephites just didn't exist because we can't find, their Israel or Hebrew genetic markers? What are your thoughts on that?
So there are a lot of problems, and it's not about you. Okay.
Okay.
Uh, a lot of the things that you said, a lot of the circular reasoning, a lot of that trying to explain what the critics are trying to say, what the Book of Mormon is saying, what the introduction was saying, what genetic is saying, a lot of that is how the question is formulated. And usually people that might have a little background or some misconception or might have heard something, and then they have repackaged that what they heard in their head with their own background, their own experience. And I'm talking about critics, I'm talking about scientists, people that have background in genetics as well, believers, non-believer. A lot of the people will tend what they listen to or what the themes that they understand it melted mixed with what they already think they know, and then come out with some statement or questions and ask for a yes or no answer. And the problems a lot of time is not, again, in not being able to find in the answer, is in the way that the question was formulated. And in your case, like, I would love to have written down what you just said and show you how many wrong things there were in that in the question. Not wrong because you are wrong, but what you have asked, the way you ask it's very common among a lot of people that come to me and ask that kind of question. So we need to break it down. We need probably to create a little bit more of a background, okay? Like you say, if Nephi is historical, why can't we find this DNA? Well, have we read the Book of Mormon carefully? Would Nephi DNA be found in today's population? The Book of Mormon said the Nephites were killed, right? So why would they find the DNA? When you're killed, you don't have any more posterity to the present time, right? But is that the only thing that happened? In the time, like, they were happily there. They lived many thousands of years. They married. They had children. They created this huge civilization that the Book of Mormon talks about. They have hundreds of thousands, people, and then all at once they all vanish. Is that the only thing the Book of Mormon say about them? It doesn't, right? So the biggest problem, that's where I would start, is I would even start with DNA. I would start with, do we understand what the Book of Mormon is saying? Do we understand the narratives in a way that we can follow along and create a scientific hypothesis that can be used in science? It can be tested. That's the first question I would ask. Second, I would ask, what kind of instruments or tools are we going to use? What kind of people, what kind of samples are we going to use? And genetics is only one thing. It can be linguistics, it can be paleontological, it can be archaeological, it can be any sort of different things that can answer questions about the past. Genetics is only one of them, but there are many other different ways. What is that we're going to use to test that hypothesis? Number three, you started, the very first things you started was quoting the introduction to the Book of Mormon, which is not part of the original Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith never wrote that. Mormon, if he existed and abridged the plates, or Moroni, his son, never wrote that. That is a modern construct written in the 1980s by those that were assigned to be part of a scripture committee that were creating teaching aids or scripture aids to help people better understand the context of the Book of Mormon. So back in the 1980s, whoever was asked to do that and created the curriculum and the consensus. And I don't know if the prophet approved it. I don't know if somebody was asked, do the best you can with what we know and put it together. I don't know if there was a certain amount of personal interpretation that went into that by a trusted individual. I heard all sorts of noises and all sorts of rumors about who wrote that introduction. And I don't want to, I love all the general authorities, but I also understand that they are humans and they're limited in their understanding. And even with revelation, God does not spell out everything. Do you guys agree that God does not spell out everything, even to the prophet? To any prophets in time, it just provides you inspiration, revelation, enough knowledge to tell you what you need to do, but often it doesn't tell you how to do it. Big difference between Latter-day Saints and let's say Islam. Islam believes that Muhammad was like Oliver Cowdery or Martin Harris in compiling the Quran. They believe that an angel dictated to Muhammad what to put into the Quran. And so the Quran is perfect because there is no Muhammad head in it. It was just a scribe. The angel, which is a heavenly being, was giving him a perfect test. Well, we don't believe that about the Book of Mormon, do we? An angel gave the plates, but he didn't translate the plates for Joseph Smith. Why? Why didn't we have an Islam-like experience, right? Well, instead, he gave it to an educated kid with very little education, which was reading to an elementary school teacher, which probably has some more education. But what is the education about? Is he like the capability to read and write? Or did he know a lot of things about history and archaeology and cultures? Let's put that into that context. So what I want to say is that the Book of Mormon and those that were involved in the production of the Book of Mormon were not perfect individuals. And the Book of Mormon most likely is correct in principles and doctrines, but it might not be the best or the most perfect translation. I don't know if that makes any sense, right? Like if I would translate something from English to Italian and another person would translate the same text from English to Italian, there will be some slight differences in between, right? The two translations. And so let's make sure that number one, we understand where the Book of Mormon come from or how it came to be. Number two, that certain parts of the Book of Mormon were not original to the Book of Mormon. The title page is original to the Book of Mormon. The introduction was not. And that's the result of a work of some people that wrote what they wrote based on what they understood. Okay? So there is not moving, what the critics call it, we're moving the goalpost. That's not true. We are just learning more and making things better. That's what it is, just like many other fields, right? And then the last thing that is very important, and I never get too tired to stress this point, is the question, does the Book of Mormon tell us everything that happened? And here we have the problem. Number one, it is not an history book. It claims to be an historical book with some history in it, but it's not the history of the Americas. It's not the history of the Native Americans. It's a history of some people that had access to that record and were writing it based on their perspective and what they saw around them. So when we talk about limited geography, let's not think about it in a way that we are putting the Book of Mormon in a small geographical setting. But let's think about it that the writer had limited access to the geography around it. Okay? They had no phones, internet, or anything. They could only write what was happening. We know hardly anything about Lamanites in the Book of Mormon unless the Lamanites came to attack the Nephites. We don't know what they were doing during the time of peace, right? That's because they were not writing the Book of Mormon. I saw once a fictional book called The Book of Mormon According to Layman, or some, or something like that. Like what is this perspective? Because we only got Nephi writing. It's like he says, "Oh, those guys are bad." It's like, wait a second, I'm not that bad. I done something right in my life. But anyway, that's one problem. The second thing is that the Book of Mormon only cover about 1,000 years, but it is an abridgment of other records. So somebody made a summary of already a limited record, okay? And they chose to make the summary eliminating parts that could have been very clear about learning about the demographics and the population of those people. And the most important part is the first 450 years of those records and the abridgment are missing. Because Martin Harris' 116 pages manuscript would have covered today all the historical time from leaving Jerusalem all the way to King Benjamin, which King Benjamin lived about 125, 150 years before the coming of Christ, which means that we are missing the first 450 years from the arrival of the Nephites to the Americas and all the intermixing, marriages, war, fighting, anything that would have shaped the population and the genetics of those people in the first critical centuries. We have absolutely no knowledge of that. Okay, so the Book of Mormon is silent about that. That leaves a lot of room for speculation of what could have happened, and so on. So here is the biggest question that people still debating sometimes, or they have debated through the history of the church. Was the continent empty when they arrived? Because that makes a huge difference genetically. If the Nephi's family is the only family in North, Central, and South America, then of course all the DNA of all the people in the Americas would have come from that family. But we know it's not true. We know that on many different ways, not just from the Book of Mormon. We know that from the archaeological discoveries, the fact that there were people in America, millions of people that were here at the time of their arrival. Question number 2, did they mingle with the people that they met when they arrived? And if they did, how soon did it happen? And to what extent? Are we talking about a biological exchange with equal potential at the beginning, 50%, 50%, and the genes of both groups, the native group and the Israelite group, had the same equal opportunity and chance to make it or not make it into the future? Or we are talking about a small family, 50 people coming in a group of 25 million or 50 million people and being absorbed by them? Huge difference in what is the output or the expectation of genetics for future generations, right? Did they keep to themselves for a number of years, enough to grow large enough so that there will be a competitive genetic pool with the local pool, or did they immediately mingle with them? And if you read the record, it seems like the Laman and Lemuel left, Nephi left, but Laman and Lemuel left the church, left the beliefs, left the regional core group very early, as soon as they got to the American continent. What did they do? If there was other people, did they embrace their way? Were they assimilated by them right away? We don't know. Nothing of that is said in the Book of Mormon. So here what we have, we got, and the reason I'm telling you this and to tell you it's important is that the professor I did my PhD with, Professor Torroni, which by the way wrote the endorsement to my book on DNA and the Book of Mormon, is one of the endorsement on the back. He was contacted by critics that wanted to prove the Book of Mormon to be wrong from a DNA point of view. Okay. Of course, Professor Torroni, who's not a member of the church, knows nothing about the Book of Mormon and what he says. And of course, he doesn't have the time to sit and not only read it, but even more study it, understand it, put it into a population and historical context, right? He didn't do any of that. So where did he learn about the Book of Mormon? Well, he learned it from what the critics told him that we believe about the Book of Mormon, including, and I know that because I had conversation with him. He was my mentor, right? And it's like, they told him when the continent was empty, a family of Israelites came and they peopled the whole continent. And the Mormons believe that they are the only people that were here, and therefore that the DNA should be Israelite. And they ask him the question, do you believe that to be the case? And of course, what do you think the answer was?
Probably said no.
It says, no, no way. It cannot be possible. There is Native American DNA. The DNA is Asian, of Asian origin. They came from the Bering Strait. Like what is Mormon, this crazy Mormon belief is possible. But that's because he was fed a limited or incorrect or superficial background. But when the story is proposed in a more of a broader term, and you ask the question, which question, by the way, has been answered by many known Latter-day Saint geneticists. Okay, there've been publications, there've been interviews, even interviewed by critics of the church to these known members of the church geneticists, and they ask this question: what is the chance to find DNA in the modern population of a small group of 50 individuals coming into a large group of 25 million people? What is the chance to find that DNA today? Guess what they said? Zero.
Zero, yeah.
Right. And these are known Latter-day Saints population geneticists. So the thing all comes, what it boils down to is, how do we frame the history and the context of where we place the Book of Mormon and its people in? And do we have the instrument or the knowledge to help address those questions in a way that we are sure about it? Question about admixture with inbreeding or mingling with local population. How soon that happen? To what extent? And how many people live in the same area? And I came to the conclusion by looking at similar people and similar events in the history of mankind. I'm from Rome. Rome have done a lot of conquering and moving people around. What I came to a conclusion is that we are talking more about a cultural expansion more than a biological and a genetic expansion. We're talking about teachings. We're talking about way of living. Just like the Romans. What did the Romans do? A lot of people, the Romans built a huge highway throughout Europe. And for many years, people believed that those highways, some of them still exist today and still have the names from the Roman Empire. They believed they did that so they could go and conquer people. Well, that's not true. You go conquer people first, and then you build a road after. You don't build, it's like, hey, wait, we cannot fight you yet. We cannot conquer you yet because we haven't put down the stone for the road that takes you to your town yet. So hold on, everybody, right? That's not what happened. They did that mostly for cultural expansion, cultural teachings. The Romans were the power. The Greeks were the teachers. And the Romans involved the Greeks and sent Greek teachers everywhere. Every Roman city had a Greek temple, had a Greek school, and they were doing all the teachings. And so they were conquering people not only through power, to war, but they were conquering people by making all them thinking the same way. That they were united based on their thinking, on their philosophy, the Greek philosophy that Elder Maxwell so many times attacked or condemned, with some of the incorrect issue. But that's what they were doing. Can you conquer or make people celestial by teaching them celestial principles? Well, we have 80,000 missionaries in the world that are doing that right now, right? Are they changing the DNA of the people? No. Are they teaching them principles that lead them to change their way of life and embrace a culture and call each other brothers and sisters and be in one mind? That's what Zion is. That's what Enoch Zion's is. One heart, one mind, one purpose, right? So maybe that's not what you were hoping to get in answer to your question, but I hope you understand that the genetic and historical context of where those questions come from is fundamental. And we are unable to establish the foundation for a true, accurate genetic approach to that question, to those questions.
That's a great answer. I think that it is like just a great principle in general, not even just only in DNA studies, but to make sure that you formulate the question very carefully And because you can like if you use like too absolute language, for example, like critics will use like there are like no possibility of this, or the DNA proves the Book of Mormon false. You just you kind of know the person doesn't know what they're talking about, right? Because
Yeah, that's
like you were
that's the
talking
thing.
about in your
No.
fair thing, it's like you got to play by the rules. You got to understand how DNA works. It's not as sure as you're saying.
Yeah, like I say, we cannot find genetic Israelites DNA. Okay, number one, why would you expect to find them? Just because the Book of Mormon said there was a family going there? Okay, where did they land? Where are you looking for them? What do they look like? What is that you're really looking at? What would have been the DNA of Lehi and his family that we are looking for that DNA in the present population? Well, we know what the DNA of ancient Israelites look because we had archaeological digs and we did the DNA testing on these people. And I was like, well, do they all look the same? Like clones of the same DNA? Or there is genetic variation and outliers and unique genetic combination? And how does Lehi and his family fit into that context of ancient Israel? We know that modern Israel DNA is not the same of ancient Israel DNA, for one thing, and there have been a lot of things before and after, and there been never really a complete population replacement where you had people with a certain amount of DNA. I did a genetic study on the people of Panama. I did several of them actually, different publications on the people of Panama, and the historical records show that Europeans basically killed all the Native Americans in Panama. They overworked them through warfare and disease and slavery. Every single Native American of Panama died, right? So they needed to fight before slavery became like a thing. The African slavery became a thing. One of the things they did was enslaving local natives. Okay, that was what Europeans did. So what did the Spaniards did? They went to Colombia, South America, in Colombia, and they took natives there and brought them to Panama. So people thought that there was a replacement of the Native Americans from the original Panamanians, completely eliminated, replaced by new natives from Colombia. Well, we did genetic studies on the population, and guess what we found? Yes, culturally they have been replaced, but the genetics is still the one that is unique to Panama. There are some markers which are not found in Colombia or in North America that are unique to Panama that show that there is the evidence of at least a population that existed before this migration. That's an example that show like how history and genetics not always follow the same. They not always go hand in hand. Okay, and we're talking about major replacement. We're not talking about one guy or two guys or 50 guys. We're talking about thousands of people being moved around through these processes. And that's kind of what we have right now here with the Book of Mormon. How you formulate this study, what kind of questions are you trying to answer, and what is the data that you can test to. And like I tease some of my friends that are large, very important, very well published population geneticists, and it's like, hey, I'm a Mormon. I told them, that's when you could use the word Mormon, and it's like. It's like, like, do you think that it would be possible to do a scientific project where we look for DNA markers about this family in the Americas? And they look at me, it's like, are you out of your mind? It's like, where are you going to start something like that? Which markers are you looking? How you expect that they have survived together today with, being such a small group of people? Where would you looking for them? What would they look like? That's kind of like all the questions. So they know that is a crazy assumption to even attempt to answer that question from DNA. Now, critics have not liked my answer because they say it's too dismissive. Like I'm trying to play safe. The reality is what it is what we see, and we should just accept it. And there is no Native American, there is no Israelite DNA in the Americas, and the DNA is from Asia. And therefore, that's all we need to know. And I was like, well, if you're happy with that and that gets you to sleep at night, then believe that. But I feel there is a much bigger and sophisticated and complex scenario that need to address the lack of, or the apparent lack of, DNA from Israel. We could have it right under our nose and not even be able to recognize it, by the way, but just because we don't know what we're looking for.
That's very important. And I think you're really helping to kind of just highlight some assumptions oftentimes that we bring to this discussion, where, you know, one of the first assumptions that you brought up that people often make is just like, well, was it empty? Was Lehi's family and the other people of that area, were they the ones there? And if we take DNA and we take science seriously, I think one of the things here that we see is, just because we have this assumption from the past, okay, that doesn't mean we have to hold to this assumption. Kind of like what you were saying earlier, we learn, we grow, and sometimes we have to correct assumptions that are just like, okay, this isn't very good. This isn't something that I need to die on a hill on or commit to. One of the things, there's not a lot of saint, but there was a philosopher named John Locke, where he talks about how, referring to specific beliefs and with religion and conviction. Sorry, not John Locke. David Evans, and he gives this discussion on critical dialogue about beliefs, certain commitments that we have, and then also certain our religious beliefs and the evidence, whether for it or against it. And one of the things that he points out is, as he says, it's okay to have a commitment, it's okay to have certain beliefs. However, when more material, when more research, when more reasons have been brought forth, if you don't have good grounds for that belief, then you don't necessarily have to continue to hold to that belief. Does that mean things like the Book of Mormon, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are false? No, it just means some of our assumptions are a little bit may have been a little bit mistaken.
Isn't it amazing that after 200 years, we're still here debating from a scientific or historical point of view whether the Book of Mormon is true or if not true? Isn't that incredible, just that per se, that we have not reached a scientific consensus on that, in that regard? Come on, guys, it was written by Joseph Smith. He wasn't that smart. He wasn't that prepared. He didn't, and not only that, he wrote it in a time where there was no AI, no internet. Many of the books and professors did not even know anything about ancient Hebrew or Egyptians or archaeological digs and what was going on or not. All those anachronisms. On one thing, it seems to me actually that the Book of Mormon is actually from if you look at this as a court setting, and the Book of Mormon is being accused by the attorney from the opposite side, it's like, hey, you're not true because of all these things, and the Book of Mormon is there defending itself. And in my opinion, actually, the Book of Mormon is making a better and better case for itself throughout the years, because a lot of these anachronisms have been knocked off. How in the world Joseph Smith knew these things when he wrote that? And I love the literary analysis of the Book of Mormon, not just the authorship, the way that is very evident based on modern analysis, how Mormon and Moroni and Nephi and Jacob all write differently and express themselves different, and they have different, not just different use of terms or preferred terms that they use, but also the way that they express things, the way that they build thoughts, the way that they trying to get to teach something. Like every teacher has their own teaching style, right? And you can totally see even from a father to son, like Mormon writes in a way, and Moroni, which you expect a grown up reading his father writings, talking to his father, communicating on the same language and level, that he would do things like his father, and he doesn't. because Moroni is his own person, just like my kids are their own person and do things differently than I do, right? So I mean, yes, you want to look and spend all your time looking for genetic evidence when I think you're kind of like, walking into a dark room looking for something that is not there, and because somebody or you think is there, or you want to use other pieces of evidence that have actually built up the case for the Book of Mormon better over time. The culture, the language, the authors, the literary style, like all those things to me, the anachronisms, the archaeological evidences, all these things are to me, wow, how did Joseph Smith know all that? And how did he write that in 8 weeks?
Well, I'd also just add, I mean, it when we take all these things into account, okay, we can talk about how Joseph Smith could have written it, but it's just like with all the things that we look at, through like this discussion, but also for those of you that are listening or watching, go check out our discussion with Brian Hells about this. This was back in February or March, but like one of the things, just like it just doesn't seem. It doesn't really seem that Joseph writing the Book of Mormon is the most plausible explanation, because there's just so many things we have to take into account. Now, does that mean that there aren't necessarily reasons or there aren't necessarily reasons or explanations? No, but it's just, let's just think critically about this for a second. Let's just really try to analyze this and look at all these components to it. But just real quick, another question I want to ask, because I don't want to steer too far away from this discussion, is a certain accusation critics will make is they'll say something to the effect of proponents of the Book of Mormon sometimes cite Haplogroup X as proof of the Book of Mormon. First, what is this group, Haplogroup, and what are some of the cautions we should keep in mind with using it as proof?
So we're jumping to a completely opposite side of the fence. So, critics of the Book of Mormon say there is no genetic evidence, therefore the Book of Mormon is not true, because, there is now DNA to prove that these people even existed. Then there is a group within the church that takes it to the opposite direction and say, well, there is a genetic marker, going back to markers, found in northern North America, mostly in the Great Lakes area, that seems like that it has no place here. And it is here, so where does it come from? And when you look at the world picture of where these markers are found, you find them in the Middle East, in Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, right? And so they're saying, well, here it is. There been some historical context and some hypotheses or theory or teachings that suggested that the Book of Mormon took place in North America. That's where their biggest claim is that Hill Cumorah, where the plates were found, is also the same Hill Cumorah where they had the last great battle, right? And so that everything is basically there, that Nephites, Lamanites, Jaredites, everyone is in North America. They never made it to Central America, never made it to South America. That's a limited geography theory right there. And what do they use? What did they use as evidence? Well, one of the evidence they use is that there is this genetic marker that seems to come from the Middle East in the Great Lakes area, and is found only in Native American populations, not in European. Is not a modern marker, is an ancient marker found there. What's the problem with that? Well, number one, and I wrote extensive, in fact, in the book that I show you, there is a whole chapter on that. I also probably, by accident, not because I wanted to, I am probably the person that have done more DNA studies and DNA testing on Haplogroup X on Native Americans than anybody in the world. There are not that many DNA samples to use, and so I was able to get early access to them and publish whatever there was to be said about it. So problem number one, well, yes, we have haplogroup X, and let's answer the question: what is haplogroup X? Haplogroup is a combination of the word haplotype and group. Haplotype is a genetic signature, and group is what it is, right? It's a group of people sharing the same genetic signature. That's haplogroup, right? Everybody that has that marker belongs to the same haplogroup. And that marker is defined, or it's called haplogroup X, because it's defined by a set of mutations that when you combine them together in the uniqueness, in that particular set, identify a specific branch of the word family tree of genetic lineages. Okay, so you can actually build a tree with all the DNA of the people and see kind of where they all go into that tree. We call them in general speaking, we call them phylogenetic trees, or just simply evolutionary trees, or whatever you want to call them. But they are trees. They have branches, they have nodes, they have clusters, they have all sorts of stuff. They have roots where they start and then where they split. So that's what an haplogroup is. Haplogroup X is a particular set of markers that defined by that. And there are different other type of groups. Like I'm haplogroup K, for example, and many Europeans are part of haplogroup H. But here is the limitations. Number one, first of all, this haplogroup is only found on a piece of DNA that comes only from the mothers. It is not found in males. Well, sorry, it's found in males, but it's only inherited from the mothers, which means that it does not represent any other branches of somebody's tree, which means it's a limited perspective from one branch of your tree, which is your mother, her 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 mother, all the way back thousands of years. It never go anywhere else in that tree. Okay, straight maternal perspective on the history of a particular group. Huge limitation. It's a huge limitation. Especially because we don't know anything about the maternal history of the people of the Book of Mormon. We know the genealogy of the males. We know where Lehi came from, or where Ishmael came from, right? They declared their lineage, Manasseh, Ephraim, right? But we don't know anything about the woman and their lineage. Number one, okay. So maternal line, unknown genealogies. Next problem is this haplogroup X has many branches, and the mutation rate that divides these branches take thousands of years. It predates the people of the Book of Mormon. It has been in the American longer than the dates of the supposedly arrival of the people from the Book of Mormon. Okay, and so it is different enough from the branches found in the Old World to make it like they are not one descendant from the other, but they are cousins to each other. There was a common ancestor that we don't know where he lived and when he lived, and then there been mutation happening, the forking that I was telling you at the beginning, that generated a specific, different, unique haplogroup X in the Americas, and the haplogroup X in America is not found in any of the haplogroup X's around the world. They define it by numbers and letters. So the one in America is called X2A. The one in the Middle East or in Africa, they call it X1A or X2G, or they have different. Actually, X2G is I discovered it right here. So let's say X2A, X2G here in America, X2E, X2B. Okay, so those will be the European ones or the Mongolian ones or whatever they are. So related to, not descendant of. So if you want to use that as evidence, then the one in the Israel should have been, the one in the Middle East should have been older, and the one in the America should be younger and direct descendant of it. But based on the mutation history, you cannot do that. All right, that's another problem right there. Also, they found some of this haplogroup X close to the Bering Strait, or the pathway that we think the first natives came from. particular discovery named the Kennewick Man, found in the state of Washington. That's a native skeleton found that is predates by thousands of years the arrival of the Book of Mormon. It looks like it's the ancestor at Haplogroup X of all the Haplogroup X's in the Americas. So the geography, the dating, the fossil records of this Kennewick Man, the genetic differences from the European, the limited maternal perspective from the tree, all those things create a lot of issues with saying this is evidence that the Book of Mormon is true. I have a really hard time thinking that this is actual factual evidence. Someday I might be wrong. Someday we might find more evidence, more genetic testing that will prove me wrong with that regard. I will welcome that. But based on today evidence, genetic and geological and archaeological evidence, it doesn't look like it is.
That's great. And just since we're running a little low on time, this has been great. I think this has been a great discussion. And like I said, this is I think an important thing to be aware of, because it really allows us to check our assumptions and be a little bit careful of making certain statements, certain propositions without having the necessary materials or the necessary information available. But I'm just kind of to bring this to full circle, bring this to a close. Ugo, if there's one thing, Ugo, that you would want people to get through this discussion, if there's one big takeaway that you would want to share with people and to really just highlight, what would that be? What would be your biggest takeaway from this discussion that you would want our audience to be aware of or to know?
So, and you sent me a number of questions that we could have just gone down to this list of questions and trying to answer them. But these questions have been answered many times in many places. And it's always like he say, she said type of things. Like, this is my answer, while the other guy's like, well, I don't agree, you're completely honest, this is my answer. We don't really get anywhere, right? So first take home lesson. That's why I did not address any of these questions, because I answered them many times over the last 20 years. The take-home lessons for me are, number one, let's carefully evaluate the context in which the Book of Mormon was written. Both the original text by the ancient people of the America, or the family, starting with Nephi, ending with Moroni. Let's look at their historical context, and let's look at what the Book of Mormon says. Does the Book of Mormon says anything on this topic? If it doesn't, then you're making an assumption to fill the lack, the hole that is there. And as you make assumption, then you're testing assumption, which will create a new assumption, and then it never ends, right? So what is the historical context in which the original Book of Mormon was written? What is the historical context in which the Book of Mormon was translated? The loss of the 116 pages is a modern event that impacts our limited access to information to answer those questions. Now, notice I'm leaving all the spiritual part out of it. We're talking about the Book of Mormon as a historical, archaeological, man-made book. What does it say? What doesn't it say? Is it true? Is not true? We're not bringing in the Holy Ghost. We're not bringing in prayers. We're not bringing in pondering. We're not bringing in any of that. If you notice, we haven't even mentioned any of that. Okay? We're just saying what men think about it. I'm a man, and I'm telling you as a scientist what I'm thinking about it. So, what is another take-home lesson? One, you look at the historical context, ancient and modern. Another one is, even leaders of the church have made statements about the Book of Mormon. But were they official doctrines of the church, or was their opinions, like the introduction of the Book of Mormon, of educated, inspired individual that simply share what they thought to be true based on what is that they knew and that has to do with not what they knew themselves, but what knowledge was available in the world that they had access to at that time. When the Book of Mormon introduction was written in the 1980s, there was very little known about genetics and population genetics. That has provided us maybe a few more insights that can help us maybe rewrite things like the introduction or institute manuals or seminary manuals. Like we're in a better position. We know more. There has been more studies about that. So regardless what people have said about the Book of Mormon, even leaders of the church, we should always remember what is a teaching or a doctrine of the church versus what is a personal opinion, and was that the best that they could do? Yes, probably was, but is that absolute truth? Probably wasn't. So let's leave the Book of Mormon to defend itself, not what people say about the Book of Mormon. And lastly, the last take-home lesson is DNA is a powerful tool to address specific questions, especially when it comes to modern DNA, meaning identifying unknown victims, forensic science in finding perpetrators, criminals, that based on genetic evidence, paternity testing. But then as we move back in time, there are more and more limitations to what we're saying. And what David, I think was David said earlier, is like even scientists are very careful when they make statements. They never make absolute statements. They say, this is what the evidence suggests. We think that's what it means. We believe that. But there is ground for more testing and more, maybe more samples will come. And so what we do, we don't write the final chapter of science. We write a chapter that will give the people writing the next chapter some more information to write a better final to that book. And we continue to. So we're part of writing history. We're not writing the history and the final history. We're writing history. And so that's what scientists do. It's like, hey, we notice today, maybe tomorrow will be different based on new evidence and new history. So let's leave that door open, and let's make sure that we recognize that when anyone makes a conclusive statement, they probably have a preconceived agenda that they want to defend, and they are throwing some hard, some hard points at you. But, in my mind, that seems to me like more of, I don't want to sound like critical, but it sounds like to me like desperate attempts to defend their position. I am totally fine with whatever thing is going to happen. Again, I believe the Book of Mormon to be historical and true with regard to his teachings. It has helped me in many ways with regard to the direction I wanted to take my life. Mormon is a teacher, and the book is written to teach principles, and those principles to me have eternal worth, which has helped shape my life, or at least continue to shape in the way I would like to, give me hope for my future. But whatever things will come from what the DNA or other evidence will come from the Book of Mormon, I'm going to be open and welcoming them and consider them within those contexts that I told you before.
Awesome. Ugo, thank you. Well, Ugo, thank you so much for being on today. This has been a great discussion. And again, for everyone listening, we'll be sure to link in our description below with the resources that were discussed today. We'll also be sure to link on if you want to see what the 1830 copy of the Book of Mormon looked like. This is a copy right here. And what
There's no introduction in there.
Yeah, no introduction. So if you open up the page, it starts instead of with the introduction. You get your title page, and then you got a preface, and there is no introduction. So I'll be sure to link that for people that want to get their own or see anything like that. But thank you so much for being on today, and everyone watching. This has been another episode of Sword and Spirit. We'll see you next week. Take care.